Welcome to
Right
the Right
side up.
Side Up.
Right side up.
We're putting the vent in Advent.
We're putting
I'm using that line.
Yeah, we're going with that one now.
I'm using that line. It was just too good.
Although it's not all venting. There's lots of conciliatory and celebratory things in there, but there might be some.
I know, it's
venting.
just such a good line, James.
I promise you,
we're
there
putting the
isn't some
vent in
venting.
Advent. Anyway, we're in Luke. Just in case you're tracking. So we did Matthew, we did Mark, we did Luke. And Luke's just too much because, I don't even know how we're going to do this in one episode. There's just a lot that's happening in Luke. And there's a few things and a few different works that we really wanted to celebrate and talk about how it's impacted us and how we've, one of the postures, I think, in approaching the Bible is perspective really matters. And I think this is true of any, literacy, sort of anything that you're doing that's looking at story, or it really depends on where you are in the story, who you are in the story, how you're hearing the story, and how the story is being told, who's telling the story. It's all those sort of things. And I think a lot of times we miss, and we talked about this the last couple episodes, but we miss, because of our hyper individualized spirituality, we read every scripture as though it's speaking specifically to me, about me. And then because of our dominant cultural reality, where we find ourselves in today's world is we're at the top of the world, wealthiest people in the world. We're part of, an empire of conquest and colonialism and all that kind of stuff. So we're telling the story as though we're not. And so that also can distort the story, and we can miss some of the elements of what's actually happening here and how it's really speaking and what it's trying to say when we kind of erase the context of the original tellers and hearers of the story. And then also when we're not listening to people who are telling the story, hearing it from a different perspective.
I mean, we were talking just about this before we begun. And I just think it's a really great place to start, given what you've just said about how our good friend Betty Dickinson wrote a book called Making Room in Advent. Wonderful book. For those of us watching, it's also just
part of why it's really important, this book, to get for this is it's about Luke. It takes a slow walk, spiritual, reflective, deep insights from Luke's gospel. Those of you who don't know, Betty is an artist and a friend of ours, spiritual director, preacher, leader extraordinaire. She wrote this book and did the paintings of this book. So the book is filled with these paintings that are reflecting the story unfolding in Luke's gospel. And she did them while she was pregnant with her son. So the perspective from a pregnant woman on the Advent and the pregnancies that are part of the story of Luke's gospel is that's a perspective that men don't hear. And I remember, James, I was speaking on a Christmas series at a church, and I talked about how much I hated being pregnant, which of course you're not allowed to say as a woman. It's supposed to be the best time of your life.
You're supposed to celebrate it, obviously.
Yeah, whenever women say that, I'm always you got to get a better life, man. But why I hated it, and this is why I hated it, is all the reasons it's connected to discipleship. I hated it because somebody else was centered in my body. Somebody else began, so I took a second seat. I didn't have any control over what it was doing to my body. It slowed me down. And I'm used to the solo trip. So here we are. And so it was a total decentering and then a recentering of somebody else. And then literally my blood supply is being, 7 times increased and then sent to this other thing inside of me. So I talked about pregnancy as this kind of it's really bad for control freaks. It's really bad for autonomous people. It's really bad for people who want things to be about them. And that is literally discipleship. That is what Jesus, it's when John the Baptist says, less of me and more of you, it's like pregnancy. It's like pregnancy.
Was it your first or second or third child that you learned that lesson? That's it. It feels did you need to get to 3 to appreciate the discipleship aspect of it? Or was it
James, I can guarantee you the first time we'll do it. For every woman. What is shocking is that women do it again. That's what's shocking, is that women do it again, and then they do it again. And this is why, we talk about this a fair bit, all the disciples of Jesus at the cross, except that's not true. The women stayed. and part of that is like the women stayed because actually, like Mary specifically, has already died to herself, has already done that work. So like what the disciples are catching up to at the cross are what the women have already been through. There's something, so I think there's something profound, not just like Betty is worth listening to just in general. You should just listen to her. She's a beautiful voice
she's
representing
the best,
Jesus. But also like to look at the perspective of the Christmas story from Luke, from a pregnant woman, is key. It's like literally key. And if you haven't done that, so when I preached that sermon, people afterwards, literally, it was like people were like, what? Like I have never heard about pregnancy from the stage from a woman's perspective. Well, that's what you get when you silence women.
Yeah, that's it. There's a reason.
Right. But then also the irony of doing that out of Luke's gospel, which literally centers women.
Yeah.
Is just shocking. So even to hear a Luke version without a woman telling it is to kind of like not represent the scriptures very well.
Yeah. And in Luke, it begins with Zechariah, and they go, hey, this miraculous thing is happening. And he goes, no, it isn't. And then he gets silenced for it because that's what you get. And Elizabeth receives the news with excitement. And Mary has a similar, like, just so we're checking, I am a virgin. And he's like, yep, don't worry about it. And she goes, yeah, I'm the Lord's servant. So women, they elevate themselves in this as much. Mary says, like, he has called me blessed. But women elevate themselves with their actions, and men do the things, the kind of thing that men might do. And so, of course, who better to speak of, an unexpected pregnancy than an old white man on stage, which is like what we usually got.
Well, here's what's funny, and I hope Betty won't mind me saying this, but there was a church that was like using her Advent resources for their Advent series, but they were like, but we have to change a couple weeks so that we have more male perspectives. And Betty's like, it's from the Gospel of Luke. It's not me like writing men out of the story. It's like Luke wrote them out of the story. Like it's God.
How did Mary's dad
this.
feel? Let's bring him in. He's not in the Bible, but he probably had some opinions. Like, let's just draft in some.
Well,
men.
And
Why
then speaking
not?
of the vent in Advent, last year I was at an event where artists did reflections of the Christmas story. I'm not even making this up, James. I wrote an article about this on my Substack called "What About the Men?"
Yeah,
which
I remember.
Is the number one question I get whenever I talk about women. It's literally, what about the men? I was like, what about that men? And they literally, like, they had the wise men, they had Joseph.
Yep. Great.
What it was like to be a dad of, like, it was like, what is happening? Right? They had Herod. I mean, I was just like,
and Herod's song was supposed to be elevating. Let's really pay attention to what Herod's doing, like, so we can emulate that.
And these were artists, so I was pretty disappointed. I was like, wow, like, and maybe maybe they were subverting the subversion. I don't know. But anyway, whatever it was, I was like, is it just me? But like, are we missing something that is so central and scandalous to the original telling of the story?
Yep. Yeah.
Anyway, so what do you got from Made for More, the Advent?
I did want to read from Betty today. Say this is day 7, which I started it a few days early because I'm undisciplined and I figured I'd probably miss a couple, so I decided to start early on her.
Just
say
the truth. You're
devotions.
A keener. Yeah.
Well, for this I am, apparently. It's the first time for everything. But she uses scripture from Luke 1:31 to 33, which is of course, the angel speaking to Mary, you will conceive and give birth to a son. You're to call him Jesus. He'll be great and called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will have no end. Like, pretty powerful stuff. And this is her reflection. It's longer, but this part in particular. The fullness of the time has come. The long-awaited King of Heaven is coming to earth. All of creation has been aching for this moment. The promised Messiah, Israel, has been waiting for, is coming as a tiny baby named Jehovah is salvation. Gabriel arrives to announce this great mystery. The infinite will grow in a finite space. Power will be wrapped in weakness. The eternal will step into time. The invisible will become visible. Heaven will collide with earth in Mary's womb. And I feel we could probably just spend the entire time talking about that and reflecting on that. I do think yeah, there is something about the kind of the meekness and the vulnerability of both the pregnancy and the infant Jesus, right? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen Talladega Nights and the sweet baby Jesus
Little baby
prayer,
Jesus. Yeah.
little baby
Yeah.
Jesus.
Whoop,
Yeah,
whoop.
exactly. But like,
Yeah.
I need the Jesus to be blonde. Like, I need the Christmas Jesus and everything. But to compare that Jesus with someone who was born in this womb and born into viscera, and I mean, we've also, I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but a lot of my friends have are on different pregnancy journeys right now, I suppose, and giving birth, pretty visceral stuff, guys. Like, I can see why they censor it from us, because it's like, it's a pretty gory experience, right? And I
Well,
guess
and
because
that's now, which, by the way,
yeah,
women still die in childbirth now
yeah,
in
like all the time.
Western,
Yeah,
countries. But
and in America has like the highest infant mortality rate in the developed world, right? So
but then, I mean, we're talking about, and a young teenage girl, we're talking about the risks of death being quite high.
mm,
So when Mary says yes, it's a big yes. It's a yes to die, potentially. And then that, you know, yeah. And then even, later on, Paul uses language about being a Christian as Christ being formed in you. That is literally a pregnancy image. So Christ is formed in Mary. And then
yeah,
through Mary, Christ is born. I mean, there is so much there to chat through. And we just finished, we just put up the last season of Need to Know. The last episode was with Scott McKnight.
yeah,
And
yeah,
his whole chapter in Need to Know book is on Mary and how he just like missed the importance and central and missed what he could have learned from Mary because he was a man who ignored women
yeah,
like most, white male
yeah.
theologians. So, and also even Protestants dismissing sort of that Catholic boogeyman idea of Mary,
Mm,
and he missed it. And so he writes the whole chapter just on like what I wish I had known. It's like what I
yeah.
wish I had to like humble myself to learn. So, but here's another resource for people if you don't know this one. Drew Jackson is a poet that I admire, and he wrote a book called God Speaks Through Wombs, and it's also on Luke. So you've got a pregnant woman painting her way and then reflecting her way through Luke's gospel. And then you've got a Black American poet and justice advocate, Drew Jackson, who is poetrying his way through Luke. And this, I'll just read his God Speaks Through Womb poem. It's on Luke 1:5-25. In the days of empires and puppet regimes, God speaks. Through wombs, wrested and discarded because they were unviable. This is what they do, the Romes, the Babylons, the USAs, the men, tossed to the side as detritus, what they've deemed unfit to be utilized. But God speaks through wombs, birthing prophetic utterances, the object of public scorn given the power to name the happenings of the Lord. Elizabeth is her name, say her name. It is she who will be the one through whom the covenant is kept. She, like a priestess, speaks her word while the leading male voices are shut. Enough of this unbelieving religion that masquerades as faith. Divine favor is placed on what we have disgraced.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, again, we see the beauty that comes when we centralize those things that we have pushed to the side, but also what God pulls to the center, right? In my mind, it's just a realignment with how we're created to be. Like, I think we are created in God's image and likeness. And so when we do the things that God does, these things sing, there's harmony. And that's what that poem feels like to me. It feels like song, it feels like harmony. It feels like, that's how this is supposed to be. That's what this is supposed to look like.
Well, and Drew talks about how he wrote these poems after George Floyd died in America, sort of being on that. So even that line, say her name, you may recognize that as a motto, like a mantra that happens where it's like a Black person is killed by police violence or in a way that nobody else cares about. They're like, say their names, like these people matter. So you're getting this like felt reality of being an oppressed minority And then, and then God saying her name, like God showing up to actually uplift and to say, these are the people that matter in the story, even though in the dominant culture, they don't matter at all. So it's that beautiful felt reality of the subversive nature of the good news, not just in what it says, but in how it comes, and that's that story of Advent that's so profound. So Luke is also, this is one of the passages I also took with Lisa Sharon Harper. And I took a course called Decolonizing the Bible, which I highly recommend and recommend any of her work, actually. She's remarkable. She's taught me a lot. And this is the lesson that she was teaching that we used this passage, Luke chapter 1 for, was watch for the flow of power. So one of the principles of decolonizing the Bible is to pay attention to the flow of power in the text. Okay. So James, you sort of mentioned this a little bit already, but it starts with the king. So it starts with politics. It starts with like the highest person of the land. It starts with Herod, who is like, then it goes to Zechariah, which is like the priest authority. So you've got like political authority, then you've got a priest's authority. And then the power just keeps flowing until you've got Elizabeth now that actually has the power. Like you said, it's not even just like the power's flowing past them. It's like the power's rejecting them. Like, Zechariah is rejected. Like he is silenced so that somebody else can actually speak. And the somebody else is Elizabeth, right? And so but then it keeps flowing. So then it's not even just Elizabeth. It's like now it's a little baby that's not even born yet to a woman who's been scorned, and barrenness in that culture would represent disfavor and disgrace and all those things. So it's like a reversal of all those things. And then it's not even that little baby. It's Mary, who's like a betrothed young teenager. So then now the power is on Mary. And then now the power is like in this little unborn child. And then the power kind of unites when John the Baptist and Jesus sort of meet each other in the womb, it's just its own mind-blowing cool thing. But anyway, the power's flowing down and out. That's the point. It's flowing down and out because that's the direction of God's power. And that's why Mary can sing the way that she sings. Like she knows that the revolution is here and that what Jesus will do is upside down the dominant culture and right side up the people of God.
Can I read the Magnificat? Is that that feels
Please.
like a good thing to do, right?
Do it, because that's the one banned in many countries.
Yeah, I will say, so I mean, I'll say this now and then listen for the parts as to why you might think that is. And I think, I don't know if I love this this anecdote, I suppose, from the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about this when he was kind of processing what it looks like for them to decolonize, given how problematic their history has been, ultimately. And one of the things he points out, one of the things that grieves him, is this song, Mary's song that we're about to read out, is actually cut out of some of the liturgies in some different countries. So if you're colonizing India, which England did, and then you have a central text that says, he's going to cast down the mighty, he's going to overthrow the kings, well, you probably don't want people knowing about that. So like this part is just cut from their liturgies. They just they jump over this part because they recognize the power of it, right? They don't want people knowing, like, hey, wait a second, maybe Jesus is speaking to us here. So let me read that out. My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him. From generation to generation, he has performed mighty deeds with his arm, for he has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down the rulers from their thrones, but he has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but he has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors. And you can see why powerful empires don't want people knowing those words, don't you?
Hang on, I got a song for this. Hang on.
All right.
Okay, guys, shout out to Rita Springer. That's a song that, in the past I've had on, repeat on my playlist. It's not a bad way to start your day, by the way, if you're a woman who feels invisible, overlooked, barren, discarded, unheard, decentered, marginalized. Just start with Rise Up by Rita Springer. And it's a nod to the original, the OG of discarded and marginalized and silenced women. I am blessed and highly favored, saved by the love of a gracious savior. I mean, yeah. Carry on, James.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't dare. And sometimes people how much do you script these things? I'm like, how much do you think we do?
We're just so smooth, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I know. It's unbelievable,
yes.
Isn't it?
Yes.
We mentioned this on one of our podcasts, the one with Scott McKnight that we mentioned. This wood carving by an artist called Benjamin Wildflower, I think, is just one of the most powerful pieces of art that exists. And it's a picture of Mary. And again, I think when most of us think of Mary, we might think of tender Mary holding a baby in her arms. That's how she's usually produced. This looks different. It has Mary defiant, with her fist in the air, crushing the skull and crushing the serpent. And around the outside of this carving, it says, "Cast down the mighty, send the rich away, fill the hungry, and lift the lowly." And I mean, that was my phone screen for quite a while, because I was like, yes.
I should actually redo the last Christmas I did 4 sort of traditional paintings that depicted Mary. And it was quite a popular post, but it was all of these sort of like women rising.
Yeah. And yeah, it's wonderful when we have even different expressions of these things. Because again, this poem is really revolutionary. You can absolutely see why it would be banned in places where you're trying to subjugate people. Because wait, really? That's how Jesus sees things? This is how this is how it's supposed to be. I always, when I preach on it at the church, I always say, this is the greatest song ever written, and that's not up for debate. So that's how we're going in.
Yeah, and I just released an article on Acts 16 about the slave girl who...
which everyone should read, by the way, if you haven't. It's really great stuff.
Well, all I want to say is that with these same principles of I have been taught the Bible and have taken in what the passages say and mean from one perspective that is not full. And, so this is another example of how my mind is being blown by reading the scriptures differently and just asking some important questions, like even in this, looking for where the power goes, and then asking the question, why does the power go there? Why is the priest silenced so that his wife can speak? Why is the cultural norm... This has gotten me too, James, over the years about Luke. Why is the cultural norm of naming your son within your family lineage stopped and he's named John instead? Why is the baby's name John and not Zachariah? That's an interesting one. His name will be John. And it's not until actually Zachariah says those words in agreement with God that his tongue is unloosed. He can speak again.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's just about the baby's born. I think it's about the work that has to happen in Zechariah to come into agreement that God is doing a new thing in a new way. So the baby is born John because it's God's new covenant. It's God's new way. And so something has to happen in Zechariah, as is happening in Elizabeth, quite embodied in Elizabeth. Physically, something's happening. All kinds of things are happening. And she's getting this. This is God working in a way that isn't normal. This is a new thing. And it's not until Zechariah comes into agreement with that he can speak again. So I think it's not even just the decentering of men. I think it's the invitation of men to listen and to learn and then to come into agreement with what God is doing, which is a new thing. And this now does not become Zechariah's attempt to pass on a legacy. He has to actually depart from this idea of like, this is my boy that'll take over my family business. None of that. He's not coming into the temple. This guy's headed to the wilderness because God's doing a new thing. And Zechariah has to come into agreement with that. So there is also this, and then you see, so Zechariah does, which is cool. And then, but you also see Herod does not. He rages against it. So you have these like also options in the text of like how we respond to the good news and how we respond to the way that God's power works differently and flows down and out.
Yeah, and even the kind of like that question, like, what about the men? And actually, like, hey, the men are there, and we get to talk about that, and we get to. But what's wonderful is God is actually doing something new with men as well. Like, hey, this is this generational excitement that he is the one selected to go into the temple. Like, this is a really big deal. I know it's just a line, but this is the greatest honor that could possibly happen to Zechariah ever. And of course, it kind of ends in a way that he doesn't expect. That question, like, yeah, what about the men? I think it's fine to ask those questions, but also just recognize, yeah, how many of those voices are that you've been listening to. I remember, yeah, even at the seminary I went to, right, and they have all the principals in the looking sternly down on in the classroom and in the assembly halls and everything, and there's just a bit of a theme as to who's represented there. And my friend who's Filipino, who's a prophet at Wheaton. And he has like Filipino students come to him and say, I didn't realize this was an option. Like, it wasn't like, again, I have not seen myself represented in these spaces ever. So again, it's not a kind of what about the men. It's like, you'll do it, it's okay. Like, and you'll see yourself in these places all the time. But like, actually, it's really wonderful and encouraging and stretching to see. And again, recognize, how do people experience these things differently, and how can I do that, and how can I
and that's
listen
what's
well?
cool is it's not an erasure of men from the story, which is
No,
what
not
it
at
would
all.
be if it was men telling the story, right? Like, it
And
would
it
be an
has been
erasure,
historically. Yeah.
right? It's actually just a decentering and then an invitation to the men.
Yeah.
So, and then it's like basically a story of who's going to take the invitation and who isn't.
Yeah.
And I mean, Joseph is another great example. Like, in that society, the marriage is about him. And then all of a sudden, God's invitation to him is to make the marriage about Mary.
Yeah.
And then even greater than that, to make the marriage about Jesus.
Yep.
So this is no longer about Mary serving Joseph. It has literally changed the dynamic of and subverted patriarchy by God through an angel telling Joseph, it's about your wife.
Yeah.
It's about your wife. I just pray, like, in a season where I'm like journeying with people I know and love who are in abusive relationships with men, I just pray that those men would receive an angelic visitation that would help them to understand that this is about their wife.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Be in a different kind of relationship. And that's crazy. Like, that's then, like, we think now it's countercultural. We're like, whoa, we're asking men for a lot. I'm like, guys, it's been 2,000 years of Jesus inviting us to rethink how we do relationships and rethink how we do society. We rethink our power dynamics, all this kind of stuff. And it's asking too much, really. And so there's something powerful about that, just to the invitation that God gives to all the characters in the story. And remember, even Herod, the wise men go through Herod. I used to think that was a mistake. Back in the day, I used to be like, dang, those wise men, why did they go to Herod? But I actually, knowing what I know about God and watching the stories unfold where God is constantly inviting people to a shift, to come with him on a journey, to transform, I almost feel like that was not an accidental visit to Herod. It was an invitation, and Herod just refused it. And we see this over and over again, just this refusal, this like to take the invitation that's on offer from Jesus to live transformed lives that are radically countercultural, but that are really good news for everybody ultimately.
And again, that invitation, which is, the rich and the poor are welcome, but the rich are going to lose what they have and the poor are going to get more of what they don't have. That invitation is open to you. Like, it's open. Hey, Elon Musk, the invitation is there for you. Like, if you want to come and dine, you want to come and be sent away empty, like, that's an invitation that you get to choose. And again, I'm not like in terms of like heaven or hell or anything. I'm just like in terms of relationship, just like that invitation
and freedom, your own
there.
freedom.
Yeah.
And also, like, this wasn't meant to be like categorical, like all rich people are bad and all poor people are good. It was meant to be that the rich in that regard, when Mary uses even those words, it was people who had no regard for the poor. It was people who were not using their wealth in any positive way. Like it was a locked in assumption that the rich were blessed by God and the poor were cursed by God. And so there's this kind of like mercy was not shown. And we see that later on in parables where Jesus in Lazarus and stuff, where like he just wouldn't have mercy on anybody because there was a belief system that it was your own fault that you were poor. And so, and I think that's still the case today. There's a lack of mercy because we have these like, you know, fed in ideas that like the poor are lazy or the poor are this or the poor are that, whatever. Anyway, so I think there's something cool there too about it's not meant to be categorical, like we're against rich people, because actually, James, you and I are rich in the concept of
relatively
in the world.
Yep, sure.
So again, the invitation is if the rich are going to be, you know, empty and the poor are going to be full, how do we participate? How do we participate in the God of the empty-handed, right? That's Jack Mark Christian's book on poverty and the great invitation God gives us to actually work together to live differently. So anyway, there's a lot here. There's a lot in Luke, and my mind has been blown by Luke. And the last thing I wanted, so we Drew Jackson, Betty Dickinson, Lisa Sharon Harper, all of those folks have helped me deeply in my understandings of the Gospel of Luke. And then also, we just fresh out now on Deep and Wide Academy. So James, I don't know if you've been tracking with Deep and Wide Academy. It's
follow your socials.
Academy.com. Yeah, and it's this kind of experimental space right now, but every month we're adding new courses that are like embodied wisdom. So not like academic, this can be 24 weeks of your life and cost you $3,000. Like that's like, we're not doing that. But people who embody the wisdom that they're bringing. And so it's some teaching, but then it's also some like, actually, how do I do this? So there's some like practices to do. And then there's some reflection. And they're all different courses. And we're adding every month to the witness of embodied wisdom on offer. And the latest one is around this. It's called the Nativity Project. And it features Bear Barnettson, who is an Indigenous storyteller and artist. And it's all on Christmas from the scriptures. It features his artwork and some of his reflections. Then he has a conversation with Aaron. I think they're calling it Conversations with a Colonizer. His part. Good and just reflecting on like, what is the story and how does an Indigenous perspective really enrich our understandings? The art is amazing. I was showing James the art that goes with the Magnificat, what he just read, which is a raven with the sun. You know, it's just, and the symbolism in Indigenous art is I have a big tattoo of a raven on my hand because a good friend of mine was Indigenous. She died, and her story, raven was her spirit animal, and a raven mischievously steals the sun to take it down to people living in the darkness, and is a light bringer, but kind of this mischievous light bringer. And of course, you know, you see Jesus all over it, right? As somebody who's taking the sun and stealing the sun and bringing it to those living in the dark. And there's a picture of that, Bear's version of that. Anyway, it's just a beautiful means by which you could really explore Advent and this Christmas season in a way from a different perspective and another voice that has been decentered, marginalized, pushed down. And what a great way to enter in even to the telling of the good news through letting someone like Bear tell it. So deepwideacademy.com, the Nativity Project, check it out. I highly recommend it. That's it, guys.
All right.
That's the good news. And we'll be back with one more. There's one more gospel to go.
Which one? We've done Matthew. We've done Mark. We've done Luke. You'll have to find out next time.
Come find out. What's next?